The office was already busy that morning. Phones rang, papers shuffled, and the sound of keyboards filled the air. People walked quickly from one desk to another, focused on their tasks. In the middle of all this, a young woman entered quietly, holding the hand of a small boy. She looked nervous, almost as if she hoped no one would notice. The child stayed close to her side, his eyes wide as he looked around the unfamiliar place filled with tall chairs, glowing screens, and serious faces. She guided him to her desk and whispered something, her voice soft and careful. The boy nodded obediently and sat down on the chair beside her. He didn't make a sound, just clutched his little backpack and swung his legs nervously. She gave him a gentle smile, though her own face looked tired, and then turned to her computer, trying to act like everything was normal. A few coworkers raised their eyebrows. Some whispered under their breath. Others gave quick glances, a mixture of curiosity and judgment. It wasn't common to bring a child into such a strict office. People wondered why she had done it, but no one said anything directly. Still, the air felt heavier, and the woman could sense their stares even while she typed. She took a deep breath and tried to focus. The boy stayed quiet, though his eyes wandered everywhere. He saw tall stacks of files, blinking lights, and people dressed neatly in suits. Once in a while, he leaned closer to his mother and whispered a question. She answered quickly, her tone calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she continued working. Every second, she hoped no one important would walk by and notice, but fate had other plans. The elevator doors opened with a soft sound, and suddenly the entire office seemed to freeze. The CEO stepped out, walking with his usual calm but powerful stride. His presence alone made people sit straighter and work harder. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the sound of typing seemed to lower as everyone became hyper-aware of his movements. He was known for being sharp, disciplined, and observant. Nothing escaped his eyes. The young woman's heart dropped the moment she saw him. She quickly bent her head down, pretending to type faster, silently praying he would pass without noticing. But the little boy, innocent and unaware of the tension, looked directly at the tall man walking across the office. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The CEO slowed down, his gaze landing on the child sitting at a desk where no child should be. The room grew tense. Coworkers tried not to stare, though they all felt the same question in their minds. What would he say? What would he do? The woman's palms began to sweat. She wanted to explain, to apologize, but her throat felt tight. She could only hope that somehow, maybe, he wouldn't make a scene. The CEO stopped just a few feet away, his face unreadable. His sharp eyes studied the boy for a moment, then shifted to the woman. She felt the weight of his stare, and it took all her strength not to break down right there. The boy, sensing something serious, held his mother's hand under the desk. She squeezed it gently, as if telling him it would be all right, though she herself wasn't sure. Seconds stretched like hours. The CEO finally blinked, his expression softening just slightly. Without a word, he turned and continued walking toward his office. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the quiet space, and only after he disappeared behind the glass doors did people begin to breathe again. A few coworkers exchanged surprised glances. No one could believe he had simply walked away. The young woman let out a shaky breath, her shoulders relaxing just a little. She whispered to her son, telling him to stay quiet and behave. He nodded quickly, sensing how important it was. She tried to return to her work, though her mind raced. Why hadn't he said anything? Did he plan to call her later? Was she in trouble? Throughout the day, she caught glimpses of the CEO behind the glass walls of his office. He sat at his desk, reviewing documents, speaking on calls, but every once in a while his gaze drifted back toward her desk. She could feel it, even when she didn't look directly. Each time, her stomach tightened, and she tried to look busier, typing faster, sorting papers more carefully, The boy, despite his young age, noticed too. He leaned against his mother's arm and whispered, "Is that man angry?" She hushed him gently, forcing a small smile, though deep inside she wondered the same. The hours crawled by. The whispers of co-workers didn't stop, though they pretended to be busy whenever she looked their way. Some shook their heads in disapproval, others looked with pity. She kept her eyes on the screen, determined not to let anyone see her worry. Her son sat quietly, drawing on a piece of paper she had slipped from her notebook, doing his best to stay out of the way. The day ended slower than ever, but the weight of that moment lingered. She knew the CEO had noticed. She knew he was watching. And she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The next morning felt heavier than usual. The young woman woke up early, making sure her little boy had eaten before they both got ready. She dressed him in his neatest shirt, though it was a little worn, and packed his small bag with a few books and snacks. She knew she couldn't leave him alone, and with no one to watch him, she had no choice but to take him with her again. Her heart ached with worry. What if yesterday had already crossed the line? What if today brought consequences she couldn't handle? When she walked into the office, people noticed immediately. The whispers started again, soft but sharp, traveling from desk to desk. Some frowned, others looked at her with quiet sympathy. She kept her eyes down, leading her son back to the same seat as before. He sat obediently, his small hands folded over his backpack. He didn't speak much, but his big curious eyes roamed the office like yesterday. She whispered to him, reminding him to stay quiet, to not disturb anyone. He nodded and gave her a smile that made her heart soften. Even in such a strict environment, his innocence still shined. The hours ticked by. The office buzzed with activity, phones ringing and papers stacking higher. But under all that noise was an unspoken tension. People were waiting to see if the CEO would react today. Waiting to see if the woman would be called into his office. And then it happened. The glass door opened, and the CEO stepped out. His tall frame and sharp suit drew everyone's eyes. He didn't rush. He never did. Every movement was deliberate. Every glance carried weight. He walked down the aisle between desks, stopping briefly to check a report someone handed him. But everyone knew where his gaze would eventually go. The young woman's hands trembled as she typed, pretending not to notice him. She prayed silently. "Please, not today. Please, let him pass." But her son lifted his head and looked directly at the man again, just as he had the day before. Their eyes met for the second time, and this time, the CEO slowed down even more. He stopped near her desk, his gaze moving from the boy to the mother. She looked up slowly, her lips parting as if to explain. "I'm sorry, sir. I had no choice. I didn't want to." Her words stumbled out, broken with fear. But the CEO didn't interrupt. He studied her carefully, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the office went completely silent. Everyone pretended to work, but their ears strained to catch what he would say. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but steady. "Make sure he doesn't disturb anyone." That was it. No anger, no punishment, no lecture. Just a single sentence. And then he walked away, his shoes clicking against the floor as he returned to his office. The woman sat frozen, her heart still racing. She expected more, maybe even the end of her job. But instead, he had left her with nothing but confusion. She looked down at her son, who smiled innocently, unaware of how close she had come to losing everything. Her co-workers whispered even louder now. Some were shocked at his patience. Others speculated that maybe he was planning something later. She tried to block them out and focused on her work, though her mind refused to settle. The hours dragged on. She worked tirelessly, glancing up at the glass office from time to time. The CEO was busy with meetings, calls, and reports, but she noticed his eyes drift toward her desk every now and then. Not long, not enough to be obvious, but just enough to make her heart pound each time. At lunch, she opened her small container of food and shared it with her son, making sure he ate first. He laughed softly as she gave him the bigger portion, but she smiled and shook her head. She wasn't hungry anyway. She just wanted him to be happy. By late afternoon, exhaustion showed on her face. The boy leaned against her arm, drawing on scrap paper with a dull pencil. He was quiet, trying not to cause trouble, but she knew this was no place for him. Still, she had no other choice. When the workday ended, people began to leave in groups, chatting about dinner plans and weekend schedules. The woman packed her things slowly, holding her son's hand tightly. She felt the stares of her coworkers as she walked to the elevator. Some were pitying, others judging. She ignored them all, but as she left the building, she had the strange feeling of being watched. She glanced back once, just in time to see a figure standing at the window of the top floor. The CEO. His hands rested in his pockets, his expression unreadable. But his eyes followed her as she walked into the evening streets with her son. She shivered. She didn't know why, but it felt as if her life was slowly shifting into something she couldn't yet understand. The evening air was cool as the woman stepped out of the office building with her son. The boy clung to her hand, swinging his small bag with childlike innocence. She smiled at him, though her heart carried a heavy weight. She worried about the whispers at work, about the CEO's eyes that seemed to follow her more often than she wanted. She hoped tomorrow would be easier, but something deep inside told her that nothing about the situation was simple anymore. She walked quickly down the street, blending into the crowd of tired employees heading home. Some caught buses, others climbed into waiting cars. She, however, kept walking, her son's small feet struggling to keep up with her pace. They passed brightly lit restaurants, their smells rich and inviting, but she didn't stop. She knew her budget couldn't stretch that far. What she didn't know was that someone else was walking too, just a little behind them, careful, silent, and watchful. The CEO had left the building later than usual, but his steps weren't toward his expensive car. Instead, he had chosen to follow. Something about that woman and her little boy had stayed in his mind all day. He couldn't shake the image of her typing with trembling hands, of the child sitting quietly beside her as if he had practiced how to stay invisible. He kept his distance. To anyone else, he looked like another man strolling through the streets, but his sharp eyes never left them. He watched as they avoided the bus stop, maybe because even the fare was too much. He noticed how the boy stumbled slightly on the uneven pavement, and the woman immediately slowed, squeezing his hand gently, whispering words to comfort him. The CEO's chest tightened at the small scene. It wasn't something grand or dramatic, but it told him everything. This was a woman holding her world together with bare hands. And the boy was her reason for not breaking. They walked for nearly half an hour, moving away from the busy center of the city into dimmer streets. The lights grew weaker, the sidewalks cracked, and the buildings turned older, their paint chipped and their windows patched with tape or cloth. Finally, the woman stopped in front of a narrow, aging apartment block. The walls were stained with time, the stairwell lights flickered, and the door creaked when she pushed it open. The CEO paused across the street, blending into the shadows. He felt a strange pull in his chest. This was her home. This was the place she returned to after working under bright office lights and strict rules. He didn't know what he expected, but seeing it with his own eyes struck him harder than he thought it would. Inside, the woman guided her son up the stairs, holding his small hand as they climbed. The CEO didn't follow inside, but the stairwell's cracked glass window gave him a glimpse of their floor. A thin door opened, and the faint glow of a single bulb spilled out. For a moment, he could see everything, the tiny room with peeling paint, an old couch that sagged in the middle, and a kitchen so small it looked more like a corner than a real space. He watched as she set down a small bag of groceries, just a few items. She moved quickly, unpacking bread, a handful of vegetables, and a carton of milk. Her son sat at the table, humming to himself, as if even the simplest meal felt like enough. The CEO couldn't hear their words, but the sight was enough. The woman smiled at her boy, though her face showed exhaustion. She poured him a glass of milk, cut the bread into small pieces, and cooked what little she had into a warm meal. The boy ate happily, talking to her between bites. She listened carefully, nodding, laughing softly even when her eyes looked tired. She didn't take her own portion until he had finished. She picked at the leftovers quietly, making sure not a crumb went to waste. The CEO's throat tightened as he realized she was feeding him first. Choosing hunger for herself so her son could have enough. After dinner, the boy pulled out an old, worn notebook. She sat beside him, guiding his small hand as he practiced letters under the dim light. Her voice was patient, even gentle, though fatigue weighed on her shoulders. The boy yawned but smiled up at her, his eyes filled with love. The CEO stood in the dark street far longer than he had planned. He was a man used to numbers, strategies, and power. He could close a deal worth millions without blinking. But tonight he stood still, shaken not by wealth or loss, but by the quiet strength of a woman who gave everything to her child without complaint. Finally, he turned away. The night was deep, and the street was empty. But in his mind, the image of that dimly lit apartment stayed. He realized that the woman who worked silently in his office was carrying more than anyone could see. He also realized something else. This was only the beginning. The next evening, the CEO found himself once again standing across the street from the old apartment building. He hadn't planned it. All day, he told himself that yesterday had been enough. He was the head of a company, with schedules, meetings, and people waiting for his decisions. But as the sun went down, his thoughts wandered back to her and her son. He couldn't push the images out of his mind, the dim light, the small meal, her smile that hid exhaustion. Without realizing it, his steps had carried him here again. Through the cracked glass of the stairwell, he could see their door. It wasn't locked with anything more than a loose chain. Inside, the faint glow of a bulb lit the small room. This time, he stayed longer, noticing every detail. The couch sagged as if it had seen years of use. A thin curtain hung by a thread over the window, struggling to keep the night cold away. The walls carried old stains and cracks, but she had tried to brighten them by sticking small drawings made by her son. Bright crayon colors, smiling suns, crooked houses. Stick figures holding hands covered the walls like a child's version of wallpaper. She was in the kitchen again, moving quickly, stretching what little food she had. Tonight it was soup, watery but warm. She poured it into 2 bowls, placing the fuller one in front of her son. He didn't complain, didn't ask for more than he was given. He smiled gratefully, eating as if it was a feast. She waited, as always, until he was done, then quietly finished what remained. The CEO shifted on his feet. He had dined in the finest restaurants, signed contracts over tables filled with expensive dishes he sometimes didn't even touch. But here was this woman, scraping together a meal, yet making it feel like enough for her child. Something about that scene unsettled him deeply. After dinner, the boy pulled out his notebook again. His pencil was short, almost down to nothing, but he used it carefully, writing letters with focus. She sat beside him, pointing out mistakes, encouraging him with gentle words. He looked up at her often, his little eyes shining with love and trust. She leaned closer, her hand resting on his head, her smile soft despite the shadows under her eyes. The CEO noticed the boy's shoes by the door worn out, with tiny holes at the front. His jacket was too small, the sleeves ending above his wrists. The mother's coat wasn't much better, thin and patched in places. He clenched his jaw. It wasn't right. She worked in his company every day, showing up on time, never complaining, always completing her tasks. Yet when she returned home, this was her reality. A gust of wind rattled the loose window pane, and the boy shivered slightly. She pulled a blanket over his shoulders, one that was frayed at the edges but still warm. He leaned against her, his small head resting on her shoulder. She hummed softly, a tune that echoed through the quiet night. It wasn't just a lullaby. It was a promise, a shield, a comfort. The CEO found himself gripping the railing of the stairwell, his chest heavy. He was used to power, to control, to making decisions that changed lives on paper. But watching her, he felt powerless in a way he had never known before. He wasn't angry at her for bringing her son to work anymore. Instead, he was angry at himself, at the world, for letting someone so hardworking live like this. The boy finally fell asleep on her lap, his breath slow and steady. She carefully carried him to the couch, laying him down with tenderness. She covered him with the thin blanket, tucking it around him as if it were the finest quilt. Then she sat back, alone in the quiet, her shoulders slumping. For a moment, when she thought no one was watching, her smile faded. Her eyes closed, and tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She wiped them away quickly, as if afraid even the walls might see her weakness. The CEO turned away then, unable to watch more. The weight in his chest had grown unbearable. He had always thought of himself as a man of logic, guided by profit and loss, strategy and results. But this wasn't about business anymore. This was about humanity, about dignity, about the quiet, invisible battles people fought when no one else was looking. As he walked back to his car, his thoughts raced. He could ignore this, pretend he had never seen it. That was the easy path. But something inside him refused to let go. He knew, without question, that the life of that woman and her son was about to change. He didn't yet know how, but he felt the decision forming in his heart. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking like a CEO. He was thinking like a man who had just witnessed truth, stripped bare of pretense. That night, as he sat in his silent home surrounded by wealth, he couldn't sleep. The laughter of the boy, the soft humming of the mother, the tears she thought no one saw, all of it echoed louder than the quiet hum of his luxury. And he knew the next day, he would not be able to look at her the same way again. The next morning felt different. The office buzzed with the usual energy, ringing phones, typing, footsteps, but there was something else in the air, something heavier. The young woman sat at her desk with her son beside her again. She looked more nervous than before. Her heart beat faster each time the elevator dinged. She knew the CEO had noticed her the past 2 days. She knew his silence couldn't last forever. Her son sat quietly, coloring on scrap paper. He smiled up at her now and then, his small hand reaching for hers as if to remind her he was there. She squeezed his fingers gently, forcing a smile for him even though her stomach twisted with worry. She didn't know if today would be her last day here. The glass door opened, and the CEO stepped out. His stride was calm, as always, but his eyes were sharper, more focused. The office hushed, the sound of keyboards slowing. Everyone watched, pretending not to, as he walked directly toward her desk, her breath caught. She quickly stood, clutching her son's hand. "Sir," she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm sorry." "I'll explain." He raised a hand gently, stopping her words. His expression wasn't stern or cold this time. Instead, there was something unreadable, something softer. "Come with me," he said quietly. Every eye followed them as she gathered her things and guided her son into the CEO's office. The door closed behind them, muting the whispers outside. She stood nervously in front of his large desk, her son clutching her skirt. For a long moment, the CEO simply studied them. The boy's shoes were worn, his jacket too small. The mother's hands were thin and tired. Yet in their eyes he saw something stronger than any wealth, love, determination, and quiet dignity. Finally he spoke. "You work hard," he said simply. "You show up on time, you meet every deadline, and you do more than what's asked. And yet, he paused, leaning forward slightly. Last night, I saw where you go home. Her eyes widened, her face pale. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't thought he would follow, that he would see. Tears gathered in her eyes as she whispered, I didn't want anyone to know. I'm doing my best, I didn't have anyone else to watch him. The CEO sat back, his expression still calm, but his voice carried weight. You don't have to explain. You don't owe me an apology for being a mother. Her tears fell then, silent and quick. She bowed her head, ashamed but also strangely relieved. She had lived for so long hiding her struggles that the truth felt both terrifying and freeing. The CEO looked at the boy, who stared back with wide, curious eyes. He saw no fear there, only innocence. He turned his gaze back to the woman. From today, he said firmly, things will change. Your salary will increase. I'll make arrangements for proper childcare during work hours. And your son? He paused, then continued, I'll cover his schooling. A good one. He deserves that chance. The woman gasped, her hand covering her mouth. She shook her head quickly. No, sir, please. I can't accept. This is not charity, he interrupted gently but firmly. This is respect. Respect for the effort you've given, even when no one saw. Respect for the strength it takes to keep going when the world makes it so hard. She broke then, the tears flowing freely. She pulled her son close, hugging him tightly as he looked around in confusion. Mama, why are you crying? He asked softly. She kissed his forehead, whispering, because sometimes kindness feels like a miracle. The CEO stood, walking around the desk. For the first time, his voice softened, no longer carrying the tone of a boss, but of a man who understood something deeper. You don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. From today on, you'll never walk this road by yourself. The woman couldn't speak. She could only nod, her heart overflowing with gratitude. For years she had fought silently, smiling at work while crying in the dark. And now, with one decision, everything had changed. When she left the office that day, the whispers of coworkers followed her again. But this time, it was different. They weren't whispers of judgment. They were whispers of awe, of curiosity, of wonder at why the CEO so strict, so distant had chosen to step into her life. She didn't answer them. She just held her son's hand tightly, her smile brighter than it had been in years. He skipped beside her, humming, unaware of the storm that had just passed. For him, it was just another walk home. But for her, it was the beginning of something new. And for the CEO, standing at the glass window once again, it was a reminder that true power wasn't only in leading a company. Sometimes true power was in choosing to see the unseen, to help without asking, and to let kindness rewrite someone's story. From that day on, everything changed for her son, and even for him.